Welcome to the 23rd and final chapter of this book. If you are following along with the book, we're going to go a little bit outside the scope of this book because, hey, there's a lot. It's new, a lot has changed. The book doesn't really go into a lot of the information. I think it'd be fun to know if you're like, well, hey, there's a book, you can just sit back and relax. But if you're one of those people who has the book and is following along, it's going to go a little bit outside the scope, change the order a little bit. So bear with us. While I am using the book as one of the primary sources, there's a lot of Wikipedia sources used here, and you'll see citations within the slide. However, when I could, I tried to use sources outside of Wikipedia. While Wikipedia is editable, please note that while that may have been true in the past that anyone could edit it, nowadays usually any edits made by a random person must be approved by a moderator. And the only one who really doesn't have to be approved is another moderator. So moderators can do edits without approval. But then again, if they get caught making spurious edits, they could be removed from the moderator status. So, I mean, usually when you become a moderator, you don't want to just go making crazy changes. So Wikipedia, in non-controversial topics, tends to have some degree of accuracy. Though, if possible, I do try to check and confirm from outside sources rather than just completely use from Wikipedia. And even then, I'm not going to go in depth. We're going to be talking about various neurotransmitters, and while I may be overly broad and general, there's more information out there, but I'm trying to keep it to something hopefully we can still understand, even if we don't understand a lot of biology. Okay, so let's begin. You see here, we have a lot of different interesting optical illusions. We're going to start this chapter by analyzing the idea of perception. Some things will have objective truth in reality. For some things, our mind will perceive it one way, depending on how we look at it. Sometimes we will adopt a whole new view due to a misleading forced perspective that society will place upon us. While some instances of truth can be revealed by objective analysis, sometimes there is no predetermined truth. Take a look at these public domain illusions. There are some more interesting ones out there, but these are all public domain, so I don't have to really worry too much about, am I stealing someone's copyrighted material? We have this scintillating illusion in the whole left quadrant of this. Try to look at the dark dots. Try to count how many dark dots there are, the black dots, and you'll see they kind of move. They're kind of just outside of your peripheral vision. That there is actually no black dots at all. It's just how the image appears. It makes, when you're just looking out of the corner of your eye, the dots appear to like overlap with the white. Look at the two yellow lines and the pair of the circles. That the yellow lines, due to the forced perspective of this, look to be different sizes. But if you measure them, they will be the exact same size. Just because of those, it appears to be going into the background with the railroad tracks. Or the circles, just because the size of the circles around them, it makes the circles look to be different sizes, even though they're actually the same size. The duck rabbit is a classic optical illusion, where it's both and neither at the same time. There's never meant to be only just one. If you look at it one way, you can see, well, there's the rabbit ears make up the beak, rabbit eyes the eye, and it's just kind of a weird lumpy back of the head. But if you look at the beak as the ears, that little bump in the back of the head is part of the rabbit's mouth. So it's either a rabbit on its side or a duck. So there's never really meant to be just one of them. Now, there are many other interesting illusions online. May I suggest you try to look up what's called the dancing girl, where simply a black and white image of like a ballerina spinning around. And depending on how you look, if you look at it just right, you can see you're spinning either clockwise or counterclockwise, and you can even trick yourself into switching perspective. So she's spinning clockwise one way, and then you look back and she's spinning counterclockwise. But it's really hard to trick yourself into switching on a whim. It's also, if you remember, the Yanny Laurel controversy of 2018, where someone had a little audio clip, and depending on how you heard it, you could hear two different words. Or the blue and gold dress of 2015, depending on how you looked at this perspective, was it a blue dress with gold and gold lighting, or a gold dress and blue lighting? So these are illusions that show how different people can look at the same situation and yet come to completely different conclusions. In this chapter, we will look at medicines and drugs and how the line between them can often be mighty fine. Our brain is incredibly powerful, and once convinced of something, we can even generate a physical response to a mental stimulation. Take the placebo effect, which we'll talk about at the end of the chapter again. A pill taken with the perception of it being medicine can generate a real-world medical response. Placebo is Latin for "I shall be pleasing," that to please, to pacify. A study from 2008 suggests that the placebo effect can even work if the patient knows it's a placebo. So this can make determining medicinal effectiveness a very tricky business, where a desire for a cure will create the self-fulfilling prophecy of the actual cure. Even the experimenter's knowledge can affect his perception of the side effects and the benefits. And so we'll often need to run a double-blind study where neither the tester nor the testee knows who's receiving the real drug. But we'll talk more about that later. So we'll start on our journey through the human mind and the chemicals that affect it with the analgesis. Aspirin was perhaps the first synthesized class of analgesic, antipyretic and anti-inflammatory agent. So analgesic, besides sounding funny, is simply a medicine that reduces or eliminates pain. Antipyretic, if you have a pyrokinesis, that's fire, that's heat. So antipyretic is a medicine that removes the heat, removes the fever. And anti-inflammatory is a medicine that reduces or eliminates inflammation. So aspirin was first synthesized in 1853. It can treat arthritis, it can prevent certain types of stroke and heart attacks, and it can lower the risk of certain types of colon cancer. But so aspirin, or as the chemical is known as acetyl salicylic acid, is formed by the acetylation of salicylic acid. So acetyl salicylic acid, we're adding an acetyl group onto that by mixing the salicylic acid with a highly reactive acetic anhydride. Acetic anhydride is you combine two acetic acids together and you remove a water. Anhydride means without a water. So we subtracted a water to make this anhydride group. And this will very highly unstable and will want to break apart and leave one of the acetic acids behind as acetyl group. So it's going to react with that OH to form acetic acid again and the acetyl group. While this molecule is synthetic, it has a precursor, salicin, which was present in willow bark and has been known since like early Greek times. Like the doctor Hippocrates in 400 BC knew about this. The bark, not the chemical itself. We knew that by sucking on bark, the willow bark, it can help remove pain. Salicin, as you see there, is a mixture of salicylic alcohol and glucose. Now, the salicin was isolated itself in 1827 and could then be hydrolyzed to form, as I said, glucose and the salicylyl alcohol. Then it could be oxidized to the acid. Now, salix itself is Latin for willow, and so the group comes from the salicylic acid comes from the Latin of salix. Salicylic acid can also be formed by the reaction of strong base and salicylic aldehyde down there, as you see down there. Now, the salicylic aldehyde could in turn be isolated from a different plant, isolated from the meadow sweet flower known as the spirea. And that's where we get the name aspirin. The aspirin comes from acetylated spiraic acid. So aspirin is the aspir, then just add the in to that. But so there's more than one way to make to the skin a cat in this case. We don't have to go from willow bark. We can start from a meadow sweet flower. Good Lord. Now, this is not the only form of salicylate that we know in our everyday lives. Another one is methyl salicylate. So notice that instead of the acid group, we have a methyl, which is a 1-carbon group right there. So it's turning, remember, what's an acid? So this group is the acid into an ester. So this is an ester, that's an ester. And remember, this group is a benzene ring. These are going to be coming up a lot. Esters and benzene rings and alcohols. But methyl salicylate is oil of wintergreen. So while this has a very pleasant smell and a pleasant flavor, and often used in liniments and rubs, very, very little is needed to have this effect, because it is actually relatively toxic as opposed to the aspirin. That as low as 100 milligrams per kilogram is needed for the LD50. So, however, these negatives are actually used as a positive when it comes to deep tissue rubs. And then as you put in the oil and rub it into the muscles, it relieves pain through a process called counter irritation, where you irritate the skin, what actually helps relieve all over irritation. That by irritating the skin, it increases blood flow and maybe some endorphins that will help relieve pain elsewhere. However, too much of this is a bad thing. If you just took pure oil of wintergreen, you could kill yourself. You use too much liniment rub, you could kill yourself. It could be, it's absorbed through the skin. You do enough of it, you will die. It takes a lot, but it can be done. Most salicylates, at least those with low toxicities, will reduce pain, fever, and inflammation. But the acid is far too corrosive to tissue, and the salicylate salt is downright unpalatable. So if you remove the acid and turn it into a salt, not really easy to swallow. So in 1893, Felix Hoffmann, working for the Bayer Pharmacy Corporation in Germany, was investigating ways to make better pain relievers. Salicylin was the popular drug in the time, but it was not really super effective. Part of the story they tell is like, oh, his father was suffering from crippling arthritis, and so he wanted to find a way to help reduce his pain. And obviously, salicylic acid would cause stomach discomfort because it's stronger acid. It's going to upset the pH of your stomach, and that's just corrosive to the throat. So you try to find a way that would make it safer. So that's not really a good alternative either. So they began looking into things like acetylating the group. So this was first synthesized in 1853, but it wasn't till 1893 that Hoffmann was able to start investigating the medicinal effects. So just because a chemical is synthesized doesn't mean people always recognize its full properties. And we'll see more of that later. But so starts investigating this, and he's able to show that this has a potent pain relieving effect without this stomach discomfort. So Bayer began selling this as powders and capsules in 1899, and then as tablets in the form in 1915. So most pills today contain somewhere between 309 and 341 milligrams of aspirin active ingredient, and a binder just to keep the pill in its pill shape. When you buy an extra strength aspirin, all you're really doing is adding more active ingredients. So it's maybe 500 milligrams instead of 350 or so. So it's often cheaper just to take 2 aspirin than buy the more expensive extra strength. The pill doesn't actually start to work until it's absorbed into the bloodstream, and which requires the pill to first dissolve. And since this occurs better at a higher pH, people start introducing buffered aspirin, which is a combination of acetylsalicylic acid and one or more base. The combination will accelerate disintegration. Now, a true buffer would be acetylsalicylate and the salt of that, where you have a weak acid and its conjugate base. But this is not that. It's actually just a separate base like magnesium carbonate, magnesium hydroxide, or aluminum hydroxide, which is the only purpose of those is to raise the pH of the stomach acid and thus help it dissolve. And it's true, it dissolves faster, at least in clinical trials. It doesn't show any real conclusive evidence of faster absorption or more effective pain relief. So take that with a grain of salt. But aspirin and many other analgesics work on the same idea, that they block the formation of prostaglandins, which are these molecules I have all spread out before you. These prostaglandins are either by temporary or permanent modification of the specific enzymes that produce them. They either block them or slow them down, slow down the production or various things. Now, prostaglandins are a class of fatty acid compounds that are first found in the prostate, but normally they're found all over the body. But that's why we get the name prostaglandin. But they're responsible for a wide variety of medical responses. Some will signal pain throughout the body. Some cause the body to exhibit inflammatory response. Some will induce a fever. Some will induce platelet aggregation, which is when you develop a blood clot. Platelets are little molecules in your blood that will bind together to try to seal off a wound. But if there's no wound to seal off, they can also clot and clog the heart and other things, clog a blood vessel. But there's all sorts of things they do, depending on what prostaglandin you have. By preventing the formation of prostaglandins, it reduces the body's active response. So you don't feel the pain as much, or it thins out the blood, or the body doesn't raise the temperature as much, or it doesn't exhibit as much of an inflammatory response. So while the benefits from aspirin are many, there are still some side effects. Somewhere between 2 and 10% of those who take aspirin suffer from occasional stomach distress. While the anti-clotting benefits of aspirin can prevent strokes and heart attacks, especially for those with certain risk factors, such as they're smokers, they have high cholesterol, hypertension, obesity, and family history, and history of heart attacks, too much of this can lead to gastrointestinal bleeding, susceptibility to bruising, and increased risk of hemorrhagic stroke. So too much of a good thing, if you can't clot the blood, it goofs some stuff up elsewhere. And that's why doctors don't want you to take aspirin before surgery. That's why they ask you, have you taken any aspirin prior to giving blood? Because you're of an increased risk of bleeding where you can't clot and stop the blood afterwards. And a more serious side effect of aspirin is what's called Reye's syndrome, which is the result of swelling to the brain and damage to the liver. While this syndrome is typically brought on by things like chicken pox or the flu in young children, the risk is exponentially increased when you've used aspirin as well. They don't quite know why this is. They just know there's a correlation. You getting over chickenpox, you take the aspirin for the fever, and you could develop this serious syndrome. So even without the side effects, there is an acute toxicity that something like 1.5 grams per kilogram in mice. And prior to the Poison Prevention Packaging Act of 1970, we've talked before about, more than 40 1 to 5-year-olds would die a year just from aspirin poisoning. But with the invention of childproof caps and limiting reduced pill counts, these deaths were prevented. Essentially, we had flavored aspirin, and kids thought they were candy, and then and they'll die. I mean, sucks. There's many different alternatives to aspirin. One of them is just acetaminophen, as you see in the center right there, which is the active ingredient of Tylenol. This is a group of p-aminophenols. So P, which means para, which means the found on opposite sides of the benzene ring, and it's some sort of alcohol, some sort of oxygen on one side. And amino is the nitrogen group. So you see the alcohol opposite of the nitrogen, p-aminophenols. We have the oxygen opposite of a nitrogen. Well, I'm not showing all of these guys. These are a class of analgesics and mild antipyretics, but they don't act as anti-inflammatories. But the first type, which I don't even show, is far too toxic. We slowly improved them with like things like phenacetin, but 1893, around the same time as the first aspirin, acetaminophen was introduced. Of this class, acetaminophen is the safest and only one still in use. Like phenacetin, we no longer use it, just too toxic. But even acetaminophen can cause lethal liver damage when taken in excess or when taken in combination with alcohol. So be careful, no drinking while you're taking Tylenol. Now, ibuprofen, on the other hand, different class, different molecule, was discovered in 1961 in the United Kingdom, and is an active ingredient in things like Advil and Motrin. It acts in much the same way as aspirin does, but can counteract some of the anti-clotting effects of aspirin. The one negative side effect is that in long-term use of ibuprofen can lead to some kidney damage. However, it appears to be less acutely toxic than aspirin, so less likely to overdose on ibuprofen, but using it every day for a long period of time can result in kidney damage. Now, one that was left out by the book is naproxen, which is Aleve. So maybe not the most common analgesic, but it's still one that is out there. Now, that one is used as a pain reliever, antipyretic, and anti-inflammatory agent as well. This was synthesized and approved in the US around the same time as ibuprofen. But like aspirin, it has anti-clotting properties, and also like many of these medicines, it can result in increased bleeding and kidney damage. But I guess it's just not one of the more popular ones for whatever reason. But those are all the analgesics that we've seen that are pretty common. So remember, acetaminophen, which is our Tylenol, is different from ibuprofen, which is different from aspirin. When they say, give me an aspirin, maybe they mean an aspirin and not an ibuprofen, not a Tylenol. Those are three different things, and it's really hard to keep them all straight in your brain. But they all kind of have different purposes. Now, let's take a minute to separate the idea of drugs from medicine. Medicine is a chemical used medicinally for treating disease or injury. The difference is that drug contains an added connotation of narcotics and addiction. We often use them interchangeably. You say you go to your local drugstore, your pharmacist. You say, I'm going to Superdrugs. You're not going to Superdrugs to pick up some weed. You're going to Superdrugs to pick up your medicine. Well, drugs have that negative connotation, but we still sometimes use drug as the same as medicine. Now, the term medicine has its origins from 1200 AD, coming through the French and Latin word medicina, meaning either a medication, the practice of a physician, or the place where physician works. Now, drug has a more unusual origin, coming from the late 14th century, so it's a little bit younger, and it comes from Anglo-French droga, which was meaning the substance used in the composition or preparation of medicines, which in itself was a reference to dry goods, like droga ware, which were like the barrels you'd store them in. So reference to dry goods, which was how many of these exotic dried herbal medications were transported around the world. Now, the negative connotation didn't start till the 1500s, when with the idea of poisons being when you drug someone, and then eventually turned into the narcotics, to reference narcotics in the late 19th century. Now, whether we're talking about drugs or medicines, the term narcotic itself is pretty obvious whether it's good or bad. Narcotic is a substance that produces a stupefying, dulling effect and sometimes induces sleep. That comes from the Greek narkotikos, meaning numbing, stupefying, or deadening. They dull the mind, they induce the sleep, they stupefy or deaden the nerves, they deaden the senses. The oldest known narcotic is, of course, opium, which comes from the dried sap of a poppy plant, which itself contains many narcotic compounds. But you can see right there some of the sap coming off of the opium plant. This was known by the Sumerians since at least 3400 BC. The Sumerians called this the Holgil, or joy plant. It has been used throughout the ages by the Greeks, the Arabs, the East Asians, and a lot in America and the English. So it is not just limited to one culture. It's been all over the world. The active ingredient of opium comes from a class of nitrogen-containing compounds called alkaloids. The name refers to the basicity. The basicity, remember, is a hydrogen accepting ability of one or more of the nitrogens. So alkaloid is a basic bitter-tasting nitrogen-containing compound found in plants that produce a physiological reaction, various kinds and intensities. Now, while the majority of these alkaloids are present in the sap of seed pods, some will seep into the seeds themselves, resulting in the occasional false positive on drug tests after eating things like poppy seed muffins or poppy seed bagels, which is why they tell athletes not to eat these substances before a big competition, especially in the Olympics. I do believe there's an episode of Seinfeld where Elaine tests positive for opium after eating a poppy seed muffin. There has been a couple cases in the recent about like people failing drug tests because they had poppy seed things, and it sucks. It's a true thing. Are you going to get high from it? No, but the level you can be tested for, it does it show up in drug tests? Yes, though some medicinal testing places have increased the threshold so that if you're under this threshold, which is only going to get by eating poppy seed muffins or bagels, you won't consider have been using opium. Like you would have to have like 5 poppy seed bagels in order to get that threshold. The largest component of opium is morphine. That was first isolated in 1803 by the German pharmacist Friedrich Sarturner. He named it after Morpheus, the Roman god of dreams. Now, while this is a powerful analgesic and a cough suppressant, it invokes a response of apathy and euphoria, in addition to being very highly addictive. Another such alkaloid is codeine, which was isolated in 1832 by the French pharmacist Pierre-Jean Robiquet, and is less pain reliever, but still it's probably the most powerful cough suppressant on the market. And you can get prescription for codeine from doctors. It's still in use. These both share their addictive properties and act as constipating agents as well. So they're capable of controlling diarrhea. Now, so you look at these two compounds. Notice we have the benzene ring, we have this six-membered ring here, we have this bicyclic methylamine, and we have this another six-membered ring with a double bond, and there's an oxygen connecting those. So we have ring, 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 4 rings, 5 rings, and some sort of oxygen group on either side. Codeine has it as a methyl, morphine has it as 2 alcohols. Well, we're always looking for the better drug, see if we can find something that less addicting, safer, more effective. So after acetylating salicylic acid and producing phenacetin, Bayer had Felix Hoffmann try to acetylate morphine, see if we can make a better morphine. And so he did. Felix Hoffmann, the guy who essentially invented aspirin, also invented heroin. This diacetylmorphine was much more powerful, so much so it was believed that it wouldn't be addictive because you could use much lower doses. Unfortunately, nope, still incredibly addictive. So we've added 2 equivalents of the acetic anhydride, and we just add 2 acetyl groups on both alcohols, and that produces our heroin. The byproduct of this process is vinegar. So in fact, the vinegar is a telltale smell that back in the day when the people were producing this illegally, they could get drug dogs and sniff out the farms that was being created on, because you'd have that vinegar smell. You could train the dog to smell the vinegar and be like, oh, yeah, someone's making morphine over there. Someone's making heroin over there. The idea is that in a lot of major drugs, a small change produces a great effect. It's worth taking those extra steps. You can get morphine and hey, it's great, but if you can get a far more addictive, far more potent heroin, you can spread it further and sell a lot more. Now, fun fact, heroin is typically a fine white powder, but black tar heroin is simply the unpurified byproduct of this reaction. So if I try to turn morphine into heroin and I don't purify it after the fact, it can sometimes get black or brown. So when you hear someone say, oh, you're shooting up black tar heroin, they're just unpurified heroin. Now, how does this drug work? How does this drug work? Well, the method of action is to activate various opiate receptors in the brain. There's a bunch of different ones, but in the spinal cord and in the gut. They're extremely large molecules within the nervous system and gut, where the opioids bind to them and alter the signals flowing within the body. There's a whole bunch of names, like there's mu and kappa and delta, but we're not going to worry about them. There's a bunch of receptors where opioids fit in perfectly. The activation leads to enzymatic cascading effects. A lot of these things will either block for positive or block for negative and lead to certain effects downstream that changes all the body. So these activation lead euphoria, reduction in pain, change in moods, hallucinations, sedation, respiratory depression, and eventually addiction. But these drugs need to cross the blood-brain barrier to take effect. Heroin is far more powerful than morphine because the acetylation helps us cross the blood-brain barrier. It allows it to more fat absorbing, which can break through the phospholipid bilayer to break through and get into the brain a lot faster. And an increased tolerance of these drugs is brought about by the body will eventually produce more receptors, and so you need more drug to trigger them all. Like if you have a overload, it's going to take a while for the body to use up all the drug because you don't have enough receptors to use up all the drug. But your body produces more receptors to use up all the drug faster. So you need to use them all up so your drug doesn't go as far. And that's going to happen with just about every drug. Your body will produce more receptors. Now, these are examples of agonists, a chemical that elicits a response upon binding the receptor. Well, one of the things people use to treat morphine and opium addiction is methadone. Methadone is an example of an agonist as well. This one will activate methadone, completely different looking structure, will activate the opioid receptors. Now, while methadone binds the receptors and induces a greater effect, it doesn't bind as long. In addition, it binds to another receptor acting as antagonist, blocking the formation of neurotransmitters responsible for learning and memory. So antagonists are compounds that counteract stuff by blocking the effects of things. If antagonist blocks and prevents something else from binding that needs to bind there. So it helps people forget the addiction. And of course, methadone doesn't get people high. It just removes the symptoms of withdrawal without getting people high. So we can use methadone to both decrease tolerance and addiction to opium and heroin and all that, though it takes a long time to metabolize. All these drugs will have to be consumed and broken down into smaller molecules by the liver and kidneys, and then eventually excreted from the body one way or another. And sometimes these different metabolites will do other processes. Now, originally, methadone was created in Nazi Germany to solve their opium shortage. They're in the middle of war, and well, not quite war yet, but about ready to go into the war, and they need more opium, and they can't really get it from the fields. They don't really have any fields in Germany, so they wanted to create a synthetic version. So, but nowadays it's used to, as I said, reduce opioid addiction. So, as I said in my argumentative piece, you can't always look at the source making it bad. Just because it was invented in Nazi Germany doesn't mean methadone is worthless and we cannot use it. On the other hand, we have a drug called naloxone. If you look at the naloxone here, it kind of looks very similar to opium, to morphine. One of the key differences is we have, you see what's known as a ketone right here, the carbonyl group. We have an alcohol group there, and this is a vinyl group right there, where that we have a carbon double bond to that methyl, essentially. So a little bit change there. Now, naloxone acts as a full opiate antagonist, meaning that it binds very strongly to the receptors. Then, in fact, it kicks out all the opium. It kicks out and prevents opium from binding to the receptors, and it's so effective it will counteract an overdose and induce withdrawal symptoms immediately, like you didn't have any opium at all. And this is what people do when they someone's dying from an opium overdose, or opioid overdose, you jam that into them, and it just brings them out of it and saves their life. There's a lot of talk about that police officers should have naloxone, and medics should have naloxone to help prevent overdoses and save people's lives. But it's not super cheap, so people wanted to pinch pennies. Don't believe we should have that. Now, you may be asking, so how does an antagonist work? Essentially, it binds and it changes the protein's shape so that opiates will no longer fit into the structure. So if it can't bind there, there's not a whole, the lock and key method, the idea that an enzyme has something that fits there perfectly, and when it fits in there, it works, you like unlock it. Well, why does a body have a bunch of receptors that seems to perfectly fit opium? And the idea is that the body did not evolve this way to fit opium. It just so happens that evolution kind of works concurrently, that the body made something that works like opium, and opium just happens to exist and involved somewhere else. But the receptor, we don't have this receptor for the plant derivative. We have this receptor for various proteins in our body. The body produces various types of proteins of one type of these 5 peptide sequences called enkephalins, which comes from the Greek word meaning within the head, that will act as agonists for these receptors. So they will trigger the opiate receptors, these enkephalins. They're named, there's only 2 types known at this time, the leucine and methionine enkephalins, and they're named by the one amino acid group they differ by. But so you can see right here, methionine enkephalin, we haven't really talked about amino acids and proteins, but this one last guy at the end, this sulfur containing one, is a thio meaning sulfur, onin. So the nitrogen, this group is the functional group, the methionine, and the acid part of this amino acid, part of this protein. Well, these enkephalins are incorporated in larger proteins called endorphins, meaning endogenous, formed within morphine. Endogenous morphine is an endorphin. These are the opiates that are produced naturally within bodies of animals. So these are formed in the pituitary gland and act as the body's natural reward and pain and stress management drugs. So your body produces these and releases those. Oh, you're suffering pain, we need to like kind of reduce that. You produce some endorphins. Beta endorphin is responsible for this effect, and it's also responsible for the effect called the runner's high. So you're running and you feel that the buzz from running a long distance. That's because your body's producing beta endorphin to try to like reduce some of this issue. And of course, endorphins, because they bind to the opiate receptors, will also be kicked out by naloxone, but more on that later. So that's our basic drug: opium, morphine, and heroin. So the next class we're looking at is the plant-based alkaloid is cocaine. While this does resemble morphine to some extent by having bicyclic methylamine groups, its properties differ quite a lot. It may generate the euphoria like morphine, but it also adds a great sense of well-being and delusions of immense power, which is followed by a sharp drop into depression. Now, this depression helps add to the craving for more. So you're feeling super high, and now you're low. And so you want to take more to get back that feeling. So, but unlike opioids, there is no physical withdrawal symptoms. Like if you stop taking opioids, your body will physically respond craving more. This one is more of a psychological response. However, this addiction is still very much so real. Cocaine, besides giving you that high, can be used as a local anesthetic. And we'll talk more about that later. Now, Sigmund Freud, of famed psychologist, used cocaine in the treatment of patients. He was one of the first to discover its addictive properties and useful properties as well. He used cocaine to break a fellow physician, Karl Kohler, from his morphine dependency. So he was stuck on morphine, and they used cocaine to break him from that, well, at the cost of, now he's addicted to cocaine, but maybe cocaine's not as bad. But Kohler began utilizing cocaine to anesthetize patients' eyes during medical procedures. So you use it as a local anesthetic so the eyes don't twitch around as much and you could do surgeries that you need to do. That was in 1884. Within a year, cocaine was also being used in dentistry to anesthetize the gums and teeth. In fact, Coca-Cola shares a similar story with John Pemberton, a Confederate colonel and pharmacist, was addicted to morphine to help treat a war wound. So he got injured during the war. He started taking morphine to help do the pain, and then he's addicted. So he was trying to find a way to break the morphine addiction. He patented a mixture of coca wine, which is wine and cocaine, and African cola nut, which is the source of caffeine in this. And so he had the Coca-Cola. In 1886, he had to introduce a non-alcoholic version in response to a local alcohol prohibition in his state. And so Coca-Cola, as we know it, was born. And of course, well, eventually they had to remove the cocaine, but that's the origin stories of Coca-Cola, essentially. Now, like all bases, cocaine will react with an acid to form a salt. And when it's actually isolated from the coca plant, it's isolated as that salt of cocaine hydrochloride. So you see that in the bottom left structure, cocaine hydrochloride, and which is a fine powder that's capable of being snorted, injected, but it has a very high boiling point, high vaporization point, cannot easily be smoked. It just, inorganic compounds like salts do not boil easily. And so you can't really easily smoke that. But by treating this with a base like baking soda and heating, you will remove the hydrogen from the cocaine and decompose the resulting carbonic acid into CO2 and water. And thus you get a lumpy solid known as crack cocaine. And because of this is more organic in nature rather than inorganic, it has a much lower vaporization point and can be easily smoked. By smoking this, you get a stronger, faster high that lasts for a shorter time, and the fall into depression is often much steeper. So not really the best thing, but this is called freebasing due to the fact that you formed the free base, the base by itself instead of as a salt. Now, how does cocaine work? Cocaine works by initially blocking the dopamine reuptake transporter. It's dopamine is a type of neurotransmitter. It's a molecule that's created by the brain to do various different things. It works in the body, does a whole bunch of complicated stuff, but dopamine, essentially, we typically think dopamine as the pleasure response, but that's not really the full truth. Dopamine is more of like a motivation response. It motivates you to do one thing or another. It has learning capabilities, has mood capabilities, but the main thing it does is it's a motivation thing. It motivates you to want to do one thing or another. And so what happens is typically when the body releases dopamine, it releases it across the nerve from one nerve to the other. It hits the second nerve, triggers a response, and bounces back and gets reabsorbed and stored again in the neuron to be used again later. What cocaine does is it blocks the reuptake. It essentially proves a plug. And so the dopamine instead bounces, triggers the next nerve, comes back, bounces, and then bounces again and keeps bouncing like a giant game of brick break and keeps triggering the response. And you keep on hitting the send motivation signal, send motivation signal, send motivation signal. So send the dopamine response over and over and over again and doesn't get reabsorbed right away. So you get a build of dopamine that triggers a lot of things. And of course, cocaine can also block sodium ion channels. The body has a series of channels where certain salts can flow in and flow out and help send certain signals. And by blocking these channels, it can slow down pain response signals, thus resulting in its anesthetizing properties. So it blocks down the pain response, so they're still feeling the pain, but the brain doesn't hear the warning as quickly. So blocks the pain locally. So a similar compound, similar derivative, atropine, is present in all manner of toxic plants, such as nightshade and mandrake, for you Harry Potter fans. Mandrake root has atropine. This was a common source of medieval poisoning, that you take a little bit of this, it's not too bad, but take too much of it and it will kill you. And so you could sneak that in there. And of course, you essentially suffer overdose, which is why kings would often try to take a little bit of poison, and they could essentially build up a tolerance to these things, and they wouldn't die when someone tried to overdose them on this. But it's named after Atropa belladonna, its source, which in turn, Atropa belladonna was named after Atropos, the Greek fate responsible for ending the mortal's life. If you've ever seen the Disney movie Hercules, it's the fate that has the scissors that cuts the thread that makes all mortals die. But belladonna in itself means pretty lady, and it's often used to dilate pupils to make people appear more beautiful. Ironically, it's also used to counteract organophosphate poisonings and nerve agents such as sarin gas and VX gas that soldiers often have some atropine shot. Like if they breathe in nerve agent, they shoot that into their thigh and essentially relaxes the muscles that would normally seize up and spasm and kill them. So you're injecting a cocaine derivative to essentially save your life. And then another derivative of the nightshade family is scopolamine, which is a powerful sedative. Notice that the difference between cocaine and atropine is just the instead of a ester, we have an alcohol. And now scopolamine, the big difference is that we have what's called a three-membered epoxide ring at the bottom of the bicyclic nitrogen group. Scopolamine comes from a different form of nightshade, but it's often it was used to induce a twilight sleep during pregnancy delivery. That is, and it's currently used to treat motion sickness and sedatives. But due to the effects on memory and cognition, it was at one time investigated as use as a truth serum. And I'll take those with a grain of salt. And there was some belief that this was used in various horrible crimes, like as a roofie kind of thing. But most of those crimes have been highly exaggerated. Two more plant derivatives, alkaloids, are alkaloids, but these are usually thought as not super dangerous. To caffeine and nicotine. Caffeine is a stimulant for the central nervous system. It acts as an adenosine receptor. It's an antagonist. Antagonist by blocking adenosine from binding. And an action that would normally make us very drowsy. That when your body's up for long periods of time, it starts producing more adenosine that will bind and tell your body it needs to sleep. And by blocking that, it says, well, nope, don't need to sleep, not feeling drowsy. And this in turn leads to uninhibiting another neurotransmitter downstream that will also promote alertness. So it really wakes you up. It keeps you from getting drowsy and wakes you up. Now, a typical soda contains somewhere between 35 to 55 milligrams of caffeine. A cup of coffee contains 100 to 150 milligrams. Even decaf contains some amount of caffeine, just like maybe 5, 10 milligrams. But there is still some caffeine in decaf coffee. Well, caffeine is toxic, and it has an LD50 of about 10 grams for the average human of about 150 pounds. So that's really kind of hard to obtain by drinking coffee. So without the use of pills, but it's possible to do it. And some people who are highly sensitive to caffeine have had a fatal dosage at about 4 grams, maybe a little bit less. So it can still kill you, but it's not super easy. Now, nicotine is actually far more toxic and is often used as an insecticide, and it's a natural insecticide produced by plants. Now, new data suggests that LD50 is not 50 milligrams, as the book suggests, but closer to 500 milligrams. But it's still less than that for children. So I'm going to take that with a grain of salt that the book says 50 milligrams, but new data is out there. And the average cigarette contains about 10 milligrams of nicotine, though. But a smoker, as he smokes a cigarette, only gets close to about 2 milligrams. So whether this is due to incomplete vaporization, airflow blowing away, partial oxidation of the nicotine, so it's not the same product. Sources don't really confirm, but it's just on average, you get maybe about 2 of those 10. Now, pipe tobacco often contains higher amounts of nicotine, but really the danger in nicotine and the danger of smoking doesn't come from the nicotine itself. A lot of the byproducts of combustion, such as you produce carbon monoxide because you don't heat it up high enough to fully oxidize the carbon into CO2, and you form various carcinogens. And these carcinogens aren't always naturally in the cigarette, and that's the key thing, that it doesn't make sense to put a lot of these carcinogens in there. It's just what is safe at room temperature may not always be safe after burning, that they are maybe coming from safe additives that when you burn them, you convert them into sometimes dangerous substances. It doesn't make sense to put a bunch of formaldehyde in the tobacco if you can help it, but when you burn things, you oxidize them and you produce formaldehyde. Now, there's also various metals present in tobacco leaf. That why would you put metals in there? It's like, well, sometimes it's the pesticide, sometimes it's just where it's grown. There's metal in the soil, it's uptaken in there. That the tobacco also has a small amount of polonium, radioactive polonium that's taken up from the soil. So that adds a little bit of radioactivity to this. So hookahs, people I think, well, the hookah pipe is a lot safer. Well, no, it's not really. There aren't really any better because you're using charcoal combustion. That produces just as much CO and tar and other carcinogens, if not more than just smoking it directly. So hookah is not really any safer. Options like dip and snuff, they don't produce any oxidative products because you're not burning it. However, there are still some dissolvable chemicals in the plants that do cause issue. There's belief that maybe the polonium, as I said, might be what's causing the mouth cancer. That's kind of a little bit less studied. Now, even e-cigarettes are not fully safe. And no, I'm not talking about e-cigarettes that explode. I'm talking about the e-cigarettes, how they deliver the nicotine. While they typically do deliver less nicotine than a cigarette, all without the complete combustion. That nicotine is vaporized by heating a solution of propylene glycol and glycerin, which, like many additives, are safe at room temperature when unmodified. But when heated to the vaporization temperatures, they can sometimes cause oxidation, especially if they're heated too high. If you do a dry puff where you don't get enough liquid touching the heating mantle, essentially, you could over-oxidize the liquid that's there into formaldehyde. And so it does produce some amount of carcinogens, though I wouldn't say it's as much. It would probably be a lot less. However, don't think they're just safe. Also, they produce certain metal nanoparticle contaminants that come from just using the apparatus itself. The same way as when you use a dehumidifier, it says this is not potable water when you dehumidify, because there are certain metal components that the water is going to pull into it. You don't want to pour the water from your dehumidifier into your pot of coffee, because you have certain metal components in there that's going to rub some of that. The water's going to absorb some of that. Are the e-cigarettes safe? I mean, they're definitely safer than, they sound like they're definitely safer than cigarettes itself. But are they safe? We once thought smoking was safe. We also thought it was really cool, and some people still think it's cool, and that's fine. But we'll have to wait another 20 to 50 years for these heavy users to fully find out whether it's safe or not. And to let them age. Well, enough about the depression. How does nicotine actually work? So what does nicotine do to the body? Nicotine binds to various receptors in the brain, resulting in the release of our dopamine, but also releases adrenaline into the bloodstream. Nicotine can also help the body release its own natural endorphins, which will then bind to the opioid receptors. So furthermore, nicotine triggers a receptor in the hypothalamus, which regulates the hunger and energy expenditure. So nicotine does help reduce your hunger and can be used to lose weight, however, at what cost? Now, not all drugs have to be alkaloids. The two most common drugs without the nitrogen are alcohol and THC. Alcohol present in the active ingredient is ethanol, which depresses the nervous system, and despite its simplicity can create a powerful psychological addiction. It does this by triggering a GABA receptor. We'll talk more about the GABA receptor later, but the GABA receptor is a receptor that kind of works on calming down nerves. Your nerves are like firing like rapid, and the GABA receptor, when triggered, essentially calms down that excitation and essentially slows all signals throughout the body so it doesn't go as fast. So it binds to the GABA receptor and sedates the central nervous system, resulting in a loss of coordination, among other things. Now the body will attempt to metabolize and produce acetaldehyde, which will further trigger dopamine and addiction response, and is responsible for a lot of the toxic effects, such as hangover. That's at least true for vodka, but in a lot of the whiskeys and things that aren't heavily distilled, there's also a lot of byproducts in there that you don't really see, like moonshine and whiskey, that can sometimes result in these hangover effects as well. We'll talk about that maybe later. But the body will further metabolize this to acetic acid that the body can actually use. And that's not too horrible. Now, THC, on the other hand, is the active ingredient of marijuana. And it's probably, of all the drugs, the least dangerous of all the drugs discussed so far. While there is no known really lethal dose of THC, combustion in the form of smoking can still produce some hazardous chemicals, the same hazardous chemicals as tobacco. Now, what does THC do? It binds to the natural endorphin cannabinoidal receptors that are throughout the central nervous system that create essentially a series of feedback mechanisms that affect how thought forms, how memory is stored. It also affects the pleasure and coordination and appetite. So, as we've seen, not all natural products are safe, and both synthetic and natural products can act as a double-edged sword, both being medicinal, and they can also be highly toxic when used improperly. What makes a difference in whether a drug is legal is its capacity to be used improperly and how society perceives a drug. Opium and cocaine were fully legal and imported into the US until the Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914. And even then, it's a tax. It's regulation. Now, alcohol was prohibited in 1920 by the 18th Amendment and eventually repealed in 1933 by the 21st. And even then, the drinking age wasn't always 21 in Tennessee. It was lowered to 18 in 1964 and slowly crept back up to 21 in 1984. Why? Society views 21-year-olds responsible enough to safely consume this drug, despite the evidence to the contrary, that we still have violence and overdose and people drinking themselves to death and accidents and DUIs. Though we have plenty of people who can use alcohol safely, even at a younger age. Now, marijuana was added to this list in 1937 under the Marijuana Tax Act as in 1937. All these were very loosely enforced till the 1970s when we had the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act. It was passed then, and it introduced all the drug schedules and making the drugs less of a taxable commodity and more of a highly controlled substance. Now, society is slowly coming into relaxing the regulations on THC as it sees some more of its medicinal benefits and its relatively minor social dangers. But we have all these rules now that prevents us from abusing these substances. Now, some of these rules were written to make sure the workers were not high when they did their work, to control the common folk that would be using these drugs. And there is some sort of racial animus among this, but there is some good and some bad. That yes, these drugs are highly addictive. These can destroy your life, but also it's like a lot of cocaine. If you look at the differentiation of the sensing between crack cocaine and standard cocaine, we're talking about many levels of illegality. Is it worth it? I'm not so sure. So, while almost all of the medicine and drugs we've discussed so far were either originally isolated from plants or modifications of plant derivatives, scientists have turned to synthetic drugs to build more potent, more safe, and hopefully less addictive drugs. The next few medications should look familiar as they have a similar backbone to the drugs they strive to replace. So I re-included morphine to show you, and so we can see the backbone. Notice the benzene ring and the methylamine group, that the three is typically 3 carbons away. All serve as analgesics that trigger the opioid receptors, some with greater effectiveness than morphine, and some generate similar hallucinatory effects. Most are just as addictive and capable of being abused if used improperly, such as oxycodone and oxymorphone. Oxycodone, also known as OxyContin. Notice the big thing is, so we've removed a double bond from morphine. We've added an alcohol group. We added a ether group, and we've added a ketone. Oxymorphone is like oxycodone, except we change the ether back into an alcohol. Other than that, they're practically the same. There's a lot of different ones here that all essentially do the same. Meperidine down there, notice it's not as a combined ring, but you can still draw from the benzene and then draw it goes boop, 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 boop there, methylamine. Propoxyphene, very similar structure as meperidine, a little bit different. And of course, fentanyl is another such opioid. Very similar structure. It's just, once again, non-bicyclic. And it's actually about 50 times stronger than heroin and 100 times stronger than morphine. So it has the capacity for being abused heavily. I mean, it doesn't need much to have the effect, but essentially this fits into the morphine derivatives. Notice again, some of them are farther away. Some of them are still relatively close, but you can still see the backbone of benzene ring, 1 carbon, 2 carbon, nitrogen, here's a methyl. It just so happens that this is now cyclized nitrogen. And so, boom, 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 1 carbon, 2 carbon, nitrogen, methyl. Boom, 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 1 carbon. This one's actually 3 carbons away. Boom, 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 1 carbon, 2 carbon, 3 carbons away. Now, much like with cocaine, there are many synthetic versions that are currently being used as local anesthetics due to their sodium channel blocking ability. Now, Procaine, also known as Novocaine, was named essentially new type of cocaine, Novocaine. But it's used in modern dentistry as a nerve blocker. Unfortunately, Novocaine is too quickly absorbed into the body, so we need to use a vasoconstrictor, which essentially constricts all the blood vessels and keeps it located in one place. And many of these drugs will either be vasoconstrictors or vasodilators that either opens the blood vessels or closes them, depending. But so we use that to lock the Novocaine in place so it stays in the gum line instead of being fully absorbed. Now, lidocaine, different structure, but to the right, is also is stronger and doesn't need the vasoconstrictor. And it's also, lidocaine is sometimes used to restore regular heartbeat. So you have a regular beat, put in there, and it kind of jumps back in place. Neopain is only used in the cornea due to some sort of undesirable properties in there. And then dimethisoquine is able to provide relief and irritation to itchiness, such as hemorrhoids. Please note, what do they share in common? They all share a benzene ring on one side, connected to an ester or amide group, and it's followed by 2 to 3 carbons and an amine group of some type or another on the end. So we have the benzene ring, here's the ester, and then 1, 2, 3, nitrogen. Benzene ring, ester, 1, 2, nitrogen. Benzene ring, amide, 1, nitrogen. Benzene ring, ester, 1, 2, nitrogen. Benzene ring, then amide, kind of an amide, not quite, but then 1, 2, nitrogen. So they all kind of have a similar shape to them, kind of a similar organic structure, which is why they all kind of work the same way. Now, not all drugs specialize in pain release or euphoria. These are a class of psychedelic drugs that specialize in auditory and visual hallucinations due to a binding strongly to a particular serotonin receptor in the brain. Now, serotonin does a lot of different stuff. You'll see, here's a structure of serotonin over there. You'll notice that a lot of these structures, except from mescaline, have a similar shape to them. So it's obvious why they bind to the serotonin receptor. Serotonin, this receptor, is responsible for hallucinations. So psilocybin comes from our magic mushrooms. It is very quickly metabolized into psilocin, which is the active ingredient that causes the hallucination. So it removes that phosphate group, and then it can bind very quickly to the serotonin receptor in the brain. Now, ergot fungus, which comes from ergotamine, the active ingredient there, massive structure on the right, is often found on various grain like rye and whatnot. And while this will often cause death and seizures, also cause hallucinations. When people suffered from ergotism, which is when they consume too many of these mushrooms, because essentially they harvested the grain, they weren't very careful, there's the fungus on the grain, they ate the bread or whatever, they would suffer from this condition, hallucinate, and die. So it's not really something you want to take, but you can notice that very similar structure. Once again, you have that 5-membered ring with the nitrogen in there, the 6-membered ring, and then 2 carbons away, and then the nitrogen group. Now, LSD is the only synthetic one of this bunch. The only synthetic one of this bunch. Now, it has a kind of interesting story. In 1938, Albert Hofmann, another Hofmann, but not the same Hofmann, prepared LSD as part of an investigation into medically useful ergot derivatives. He did some tests. It didn't seem like it was working, so he put this aside. 5 years later, he went to resynthesize this to do some more tests on, and he accidentally ingested some of this while resynthesizing, which resulted in restlessness, dizziness, followed by fantasy-filled delirium, which he described as intense kaleidoscopic play of colors. He would then go on experimenting on purposely taking 250 micrograms of this. After about an hour, his trip started. And he asked his lab assistant to escort him home, and they rode their bikes. Because, I mean, that was the way they did it in, like, Sweden or wherever he was at. And along the way, his condition fully deteriorated. First, I started to experience paranoid and psychotic breaks, thinking he's going insane, thinking he's been poisoned, thinking his neighbor is a witch. Eventually gave way to enjoyment. The worst of the symptoms ended around 6 hours, but the trip lasted pretty much the rest of the day. Now, this first trip is referred to as Bicycle Day. It's celebrated in certain communities. So all these are trippy drugs. Not all of them are really good for you. LSD is probably the least addictive. I don't think it has any addiction. And most of them, except for ergotamine, usually don't. Mescaline can also poison you, but I don't think magic mushrooms usually poison you, and LSD doesn't poison you. The main danger is you can have psychotic breaks. Now, the next few drugs are classified as amphetamines. They'll share a similar backbone to morphine, mescaline, and LSD, and the book tries to push that. This comparison, I feel, is a bit of a stretch. All of these guys have a common feature, that they have a benzene ring connected by 3 carbons, so what's called a propyl group, and the amine is coming off the 2-carbon position, so essentially an isopropyl amine. Now, they all work similar to cocaine in that they cause the release of and they block the uptake of various neurotransmitters by binding to the transporter proteins. So the transmitter gets kicked out, triggers the nerves, and they don't let them come back in. So now what neurotransmitters they block and the degree of each one depends on the drug, but they typically block the dopamine receptor, the transporter, which is, remember, our pleasure/motivation, serotonin, which is responsible for memory, cognition, mood, and sometimes hallucinations, depending on what receptors we're talking about, and norepinephrine, which we haven't talked about before, but that is a one that is responsible for alertness, wakefulness, and readiness for action, the essentially flight or fight response, which is why when the meth people who take meth, they always have be jittery and awake. Like, you want to stay up for 3 days, you take some meth. Well, I want to suggest you take some meth. It's the wakefulness. The same reason people take Adderall, to be awake and be able to focus. You got the norepinephrine response. So one of the things you hear about is like pseudoephedrine or Sudafed, how they used to be, that was a very good decongestant, but we're not allowed to order it as much because it's possible of making methamphetamine. Notice the similarity, that the only real difference is the OH group between pseudoephedrine and methamphetamine. If you remove that OH group, suddenly you have methamphetamine. So it's a very easy thing to do. Though it takes very simple chemistry to transform this strong vasoconstrictor that essentially constricts the blood vessels in the nose and helps decongest this medication into the highly regulated drug that's methamphetamine. Phenylphedrine down there, which is stuff you can buy on the store, it's not regulated at all. It's similar, but it's also very different. Note, it has a new phenol group, this alcohol attached to the benzene ring, and it's missing the methyl. It's an ethyl group instead of a propyl group. It's a 2-carbon chain instead of a 3-carbon chain. Now, you may think, oh, that's really easy to change. Like, it's not really, at least not in a drug lab. Maybe if you're in a chemistry lab, it might be possible to remove this alcohol group and add another carbon group, but it's usually not very easy to do that. So it's really hard to change phenylphedrine into methamphetamine. It's not the cheap, easy chemistry that can be done. And unfortunately, phenylphedrine kind of sucks. It doesn't work as well as Sudafed. And so you druggies, you drug dealers, is why we can't have nice things. We see an Adderall is an amphetamine. Ritalin is an amphetamine. They're kind of different. I mean, Adderall is really close to methamphetamine, but it's not nearly as bad, but it still could be abused. The last one in here is one I really didn't think was amphetamine until I really looked at it. 3,4-methylene dioxymethamphetamine, MDMA, also known as, well, in my day it was called ecstasy, but nowadays it's Molly, and I'm not sure I really put that connection, but that is an amphetamine. Now, the binding of that guy is slightly different, but it binds to the receptors for serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. But I mean, essentially, it binds similarly but differently enough that it results in our euphoria. But it changes. You get a lot of self-confidence. You get a lot of empathy. You start feeling very emotional towards other people. Very increased emotions, mild hallucinations, enhanced sensations, like loss of time. Time appears to stretch out. Essentially adds more hallucinogenic properties onto the stimulating effects of the standard amphetamines, possibly due to that, well, definitely due to that, this group right here. All these are technically, well, all these are amphetamines, well, except the phenylphedrine. Now, this last class of drugs are all downers. They've fallen into various different categories, whether it's a barbiturate, which was common downer in my time, and not saying it was used, but it was definitely talked about more than it is now. Tranquilizers and benzos category, that they all serve as muscle relaxers, anti-anxiety drugs, sleep aids, and the like, anti-seizure medication. They all work on the same concept. They all activate the GABA receptor, same way as alcohol. They essentially calm the nerves. The nerves slow down, whether it's the muscles that are seizing up and firing like rapid, it calms them down. Whether it's just the signals in the brain, it calms them all down. Helps people calm down and help people sleep. But that's also why they tell you not to take these relaxing drugs with alcohol, because you trigger the things too much, they're going to work together and you go into a coma and die. And we've given away, some of these aren't really used so much due to the various different toxicities and addictive properties. Barbiturates, I don't think are really used anymore because of this. But barbital and phenobarbital are things to come to mind. The next one are just standard carbamate tranquilizers. The only thing they really share in common is the carbamate group, which is the ester followed by amine. A carbamate there, we have a carbamate there. Those aren't really used as much as well because of various addictive properties. And now benzodiazepines are also known as benzos, are probably the tranquilizers that we hear more about nowadays. Things like Valium, which is the diazepam, Valium, oxazepam. We have fluoxazepam and chlorodiazepoxide. All these guys are benzos. Now, while they may be improved from the barbiturates and the carbamates, they still are capable of being abused. Overdose usually results in over-relaxation of the muscles to the point where you induce a coma and you can eventually die from this. It essentially stops your diaphragm from pushing oxygen in and out. Of course, this flaw becomes a feature in the case of sodium thiopental, which was at one time a truth serum, but nowadays it's used as part of lethal injection. Essentially, you inject that into the body and they eventually go into a coma and stop breathing and die. They usually do something else to stop the heart, but sometimes they just use that. You notice the benzo group, they have the benzene ring, some sort of chlorine, this, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 membered double nitrogen ring. Sometimes there's an oxygen group or some sort of polar group to it. Usually there's a double bond there and another benzene ring down there. So they share a similar shape there. The barbiturates, so here we have some sort of ketone or oxygen or group like that. Two things coming out at the bottom and the double nitrogens there. And the last type we'll talk about are antidepressants and mood stabilizers. Let's talk about lithium carbonate first. It's probably the best known and simplest mood stabilizer there is. It's typically used to treat bipolar disorder and sometimes schizophrenia on occasion, and occasionally even depression. While lithium carbonate can be toxic if taken in high enough doses, it is unlikely to be abused. There's no euphoria behind it. It's just what it does. And the mechanism is not really even fully understood. It's just that it gets all throughout the body and it starts getting involved in a variety of receptors that essentially decrease the norepinephrine, increase the serotonin, essentially helps replace a lot of the missing neurotransmitters that would be absent and result in the wild mood swings of bipolar, also known as manic depression. Essentially, you swing one way where you're like super alert, and then another way where you're super sad. If it replaces what make the serotonin that makes you sad, the lack of serotonin that makes you sad, you don't get as sad. If norepinephrine is responsible, that's going to make you super alert and super crazy, it decreases that. But how it actually does that, it's a little bit beyond the scope of what we're going to talk about. The other ones are antidepressants. They have a wide variety of structures, and the only real similarity is the halogens, which is our fluorine or chlorine, that are adjacent to or connected to benzene rings. But all of these, other than that, their classification is all the same, and because they all work by a similar mechanism. They're all called SSRIs. SSRIs stands for selective serotonin reuptake inhibition. So like cocaine, like amphetamine, they block the reuptake of neurotransmitters, allowing them to trigger more of various signals in the brain more often. But unlike the other drugs, they only trigger the serotonin. They don't trigger the dopamine, so they don't trigger the motivation. They don't trigger the alertness of norepinephrine. They just trigger the serotonin, which helps stabilize mood. So the medical benefit without all the negative addictive properties. Now, there's still side effects. and the side effects are going to depend on what structure you have. But they're far more manageable than being addicted. So you have things like I included Prozac over here, Paxil, Celexa, Luvox, Zoloft. Zoloft is the only one with no fluorine. Well, no fluorine. But so different drug shapes and completely different shapes, but they all work the same way, that they're SSRI. So that's all our drugs. Now that we've finished our marathon of drugs and medications, we should return to our friend, the placebo. Now, placebo is generally a harmless or normally ineffective substance given to someone who complains of a particular ailment simply to please or pacify the patient. A placebo could be a saline injection, a sugar pill, a starch pill, just something that should not have any effect. And it should not it's usually really good to give someone who's a hypochondriac, someone with no discernible illness. We don't know what's causing this, but they still kind of feel it's real. And the effect of the placebo is very much so real. Placebos have been known to suppress coughs, promote healing, relieve depression, lower blood pressure, and even induce some side effects like dry mouth, headaches, and drowsiness. Dr. Herbert Benson of Harvard Medical observed that a pill that was 70 to 90% effective in curing chest pains from angina would eventually drop to 30 to 40% effective once a new drug was discovered. He would believe that the doctor's knowledge and belief in the availability of a better treatment resulted in the patient receiving a weaker placebo effect. He believed the placebo takes both parties to involvement for the full effect, that the doctor would be saying things like, oh, this should cure you. But if he's not like, well, this should cure you because he knows there's a better drug out there, you're not going to feel like, oh, yeah, I'm getting the best treatment I could get. So, well, how does this placebo effect actually work? Well, in terms of analgesia, a group of physicians at UC San Francisco studied this by looking into 3 different groups of patients who had their wisdom teeth extracted. One group was just given naloxone. Remember that drug that blocks both morphine and natural endorphin binding to opioid receptors? So naloxone should not cause any pain, but blocks any natural endorphin pain relief. Then there's a group that they only gave the placebo to. And then there was a group that they gave the placebo to, but then afterwards gave naloxone to. Now, those given naloxone, they didn't have any more pain, but they saw no decrease in pain. So it was a constant level of pain. On average, 1 out of 3 people of the placebo patients saw a decrease in pain. So they were capable of being receptive to the placebo effect. Now, of those people who saw the placebo effect, when they took naloxone, their pain shot back up to the same level as those in the control group who just got the naloxone, suggesting that they were having some sort of pain reduction that was real, and naloxone blocked this, that the mind forced the release of natural endorphins to self-realize, I should be getting pain relief, I will release the endorphins to get the pain relief. But once you have the naloxone, you block those endorphins binding, and so you got no pain relief. So how do scientists actually determine drug efficacy? If a third of people may respond positively either way. So a double-blind study is needed to remove any bias from patient and physician. So typically you have 2 groups of physicians, 2 groups of examiners. One group codes the drugs, whether it's a control drug or a test drug, whether it's going to go to the control group or test group, but has no control over how it's distributed or who gets what. They just say, control drug 1 is A, control drug 2 is B, control drug 3 is F, and so C is test, and they just mix them up, so they just have a number or associated with it, and they know this number is this drug. Now, the second group of physicians will at random distribute them to the patients and analyze the results. In this way, the doctor's bias of whether he wants the drug to work, which most doctors do want it to work, will not factor into any observation he makes. And because the patients don't know, and he can't also hint to the patients, oh, you're getting the placebo, or oh, you're getting the real drug. He doesn't know. So he's not looking for something that isn't there, and he's just looking for things he actually observes. And only once the study is done will the truth be revealed. So say, oh, these people saw this change. Did they get the drug or not? Oh, find out. So only effect that is present in the test group is the true effect. And so this double-blind study will help them see what is real and what is not.
This is the last thought I will leave you with before the end of the year. Hopefully you enjoyed this chapter. Hopefully it was informative. While I hope no one gets addicted to meth, cocaine, heroin, you stay off the illegal drugs, you take what is only needed, what is prescribed, what is allowed. Hopefully you learned a little bit more about what goes on and why it happens. But once again, there's a theme for this book. There's a theme that I try to hint at. Science and technology. A lot of our drugs that affect the brain, we don't fully understand why. We have ideas. We understand that it works, but not always how it works. Not always a full comprehension of why we see this effect. You use various drugs to treat depression, but we don't always fully understand why they work. We just know they do. The brain is an ultra complex situation. I mean, there's 1,000 different miniature variables that can all affect these different processes. There's no human brain is the exact same, so we can't say this is going to perfectly solve this, and we can't always say that we can cure this depression through this drug. We have to try various things oftentimes, various dosages, trying to get things up. But we do kind of understand that this does work. So if we waited till we fully understood the brain, how many people will have died due to lack of treatment? So technology sometimes has to jump ahead to do the most good. Sometimes it does harm down the road, but we want to save people now rather than study it to death. So it's an issue that we must always fight against. Do the most good. That means taking it slow. Sometimes we should take it slow. That means jumping ahead and trying something out. Sometimes we need to try something out. But we'll always have to a constant push-pull of science versus technology. The pure knowledge versus the application of said knowledge. And hopefully you've seen this trend throughout the book. Hopefully you've learned a little bit. Hopefully you've had fun. So this is my last chance to sign off from the future. Good luck on that last test.